From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I suspect you've heard them 3 times already, and in any case, I've forgotten them all. My name is Jonathan Yardley, and I am here ostensibly from the Washington Post, but I left it a long time ago. About 18 years ago, my wife and I were living on Capitol Hill with my stepdaughter, who was working at the time at National Geographic. And one day, Lala said to us, "Could I bring a friend home from the office for dinner?" And we said, "Sure." I'm afraid that that's a technical problem that someone else is going to have to cope with. If I shout, does that help? Okay. My stepdaughter was working at National Geographic, and one day asked if she could bring a friend home for dinner. And we said, sure. So the next day, at dinner time, this lovely young woman shows up with my stepdaughter, Lala, and my wife and I were immediately enchanted with her. And she is still lovely and young and enchanting, but now she's one of the most respected, most accomplished, and most successful writers of serious nonfiction in the United States. Candice, it's very good to see you again.
It's very good to see you. Thank you. And could I just say, just very briefly, what an incredible honor it is to sit here with Jonathan Yardley, who all of you know is such a huge figure in the world of journalism and in the world of books. And if by some crazy chance you don't know his work, I urge you to go out and find it. He's really absolutely brilliant, so it's very humbling to me. I should be interviewing him because he's a much more interesting figure than I am. So anyway, I just wanted to.
Flattery will get you everywhere. Candice, we will get over to Winston Churchill and Hero of the Empire soon enough, but I have a couple of questions about how you got to this point in your life. You were at National Geo for what, 4 or 5 years?
6 years.
6 years. National Geo has a reputation for being a very tightly, if not severely, edited publication. You were an editor and you were a writer. What influence did your years there have on your own evolution as a writer?
Well, I always say that my real education actually happened at National Geographic. I learned so much about storytelling, about the fact that the world is full of fascinating people, fascinating events, and stories. But most of all, I learned about research. And I learned that you need to dig deeply, you need to take the time to understand it, and you need to find the people who really know the subject that you're going to look into. You know, at National Geographic, you could be working on something about meerkats one day and something about a river another day, so it really fluctuated. But the one consistent thing throughout is that there's always somebody who knows the subject and knows it really, really well and has spent most of his or her life studying it, and you need to find that person and make him your friend.
Mm-hmm. When and how did it come to you that you should try to write what became The River of Doubt? You were young, you were not a trained historian, the subject involved travel to a dangerous place, dealings with languages other than your own. Tell us about the challenges and apprehensions that confronted you as you started out.
So I first heard this story. I was having lunch with a friend of mine, James Chase, who wrote the book 1912, did you know? And really an extraordinary man. And this is the election, you know, the Bull Moose election where Roosevelt tried to regain the presidency and lost. And he said, have you heard about this trip that Roosevelt took in the Amazon after that election? And I had read about Theodore Roosevelt. I was interested in him. But because it's after his active political career, it was sort of glossed over. And I started researching it. Actually, I went back to National Geographic. They have a great library there, and then went to the Library of Congress. And I was stunned because, you know, there's murder, drowning. You know, they left the murder in the rainforest. Roosevelt nearly took his own life. I was set in the Amazon, the richest ecosystem on Earth, something I would love to write about. And so I was just hooked right away. But it is daunting to take on Theodore Roosevelt, to take on the Amazon,
Take on a book?
To take on a book, exactly. But I was really excited about it because I knew that to a writer, this is just a gift. It had so much to work with. And thanks to my years at National Geographic, I knew how to do research. That was the only thing that I was confident about.
But you went to the Amazon, right?
I did. I went to this river, which is still incredibly remote. Right. I did some research in Rio, and then I went to this little town in northwestern Brazil called Porto Velho. I rented a plane, I hired a pilot, and I flew for hours over unbroken rainforest, horizon to horizon. And
okay, now this raises a question. Where'd you get the money to do that?
Well, I had an advance.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, so I...
From Doubleday?
Yeah, from Doubleday. So I'd gotten an agent, and in fact, James Chase sent my proposal to his agent, very generous man. Unfortunately, he passed away right before the book came out, which was really difficult for me. But anyway, so Doubleday gave me this great advance. You get it kind of in 3 parts. One part, when you sell it, one part when you turn in the manuscript, and one when it comes out. So I had that money, and that's how I used it.
Well, I would have thought you would have flown the plane yourself.
Nope, that was
well,
not a
I
possibility.
say that because in River of Doubt, as in your other 2 books, you're incredibly generous in your acknowledgments. You seem to deal with a great many people and travel to a great many places. You seem to be endlessly curious and afraid of nothing.
Well, that's not true. I have a lot of fears, but I think my fears are sort of shadowed by my interests.
Did you go down a mine in South Africa?
I went to where the mine was. The colliery is closed now, but there's the hole where it was. Right. Absolutely, yeah.
So far, you've written about Teddy Roosevelt, James A. Garfield, and Winston Churchill. What, if any, common elements drew you to their stories?
So what interests me, and we were talking about this earlier, I love to read biographies, but as a writer, I like to tell a tighter story, a more sort of personal story where I can spend 5 years really focusing and digging in deep. And I'm looking for a story that I hope is illuminating about the person and about the time in which they live. And specifically what interests me, I think that often when we look at history, we're kind of drawn to the big public moments of triumph or of infamy. But what interests me are the more private moments of struggle, when someone is sick, like James Garfield, or terrified, like Theodore Roosevelt, or desperate, like Winston Churchill, and searching for a foothold and uncertain. And I think it's in those moments, and it's true for all of us, this is something that we all share, that we share with these sort of great historical figures, is that that's when your true nature is revealed.
And quite specifically, what drew you to Winston Churchill and his role in the Boer War?
So I had heard this story 25 years ago. My husband was a journalist for the New York Times for years, and he actually began his career in South Africa, covering the ANC, the African National Congress, in the early 80s. And when I met him 25 years ago, he mentioned to me, he said, "Did you know that Winston Churchill was a prisoner of war in South Africa and that he escaped?" And I thought, you are kidding me. How do I not know this? And so it just stayed with me all of these years. And after I turned in the manuscript for my second book, we went to lunch, and he said, "Do you have any ideas for your next book?" And I said, I would love to write about Winston Churchill and the Boer War. And he said, yes. And so it just went from there.
I wondered, reading your wonderful book, with its story of Britain's nearly disastrous war in a place it scarcely understood at all, I wondered if the Vietnam War was somewhere in the back of your head when you were writing that.
To be honest, nothing was really in the back of my head, and I can see the connection.
It was in the back of mine when I was reading
was it? I can absolutely see the connection. Yeah, I can see it, but To be honest, so, as you know, I have 3 kids. I live in Kansas City. I have just this very normal day-to-day life with laundry and dinner plans and stuff. But I have an office outside of my home, and when I go into my office and I close the door, it's like a time machine. I literally feel like I'm going back in time, and I just immerse myself in the documents that I've gathered and the pictures and maps and things like that. And I'm really only thinking about this moment in history.
Speaking of time, you seem to be very strongly drawn to the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
I do. I think that's fair. I didn't set out that way. I didn't think this is what I want to write about, and I never do. But I do find it very evocative. I do feel like I can really, that time period, you can see it, you can smell it, you can taste it. I mean, but especially what interests me in it is that there's so much primary source material. Right. It's just this enormous wealth of letters and diaries and newspaper articles, and especially for the kind of writing that I do with narrative nonfiction, you have to have that, and you have to have not like a lot or not even a huge amount, but you have to be drowning in it.
Right.
And there are certainly times when I'm working on a book and the research takes me most of the time that I'm working on a book, and I feel like, good God, I will never get through all of this.
Well, I've done projects much less ambitious than yours, but when you have that wealth of research material, of course, there is the problem of choosing what to use.
That's right. But I would be interested to see if you agree, but I think that, and most of it I don't, actually. You have to whittle it down, and
Yep.
you have to be tough about it. But I feel like all of it kind of informs, me, and I hope the reader in the book, and because you have to truly understand it before you can begin writing about it. So whether or not it actually makes it into the book, it does in a sense that I understand this event much better because of it.
One thing about the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Churchill remarks on it in his memoir, My Early Years, is that it's really a lost world. It's the period when the world began to change in incredibly dramatic ways, even more than it's changing now, because you literally went from the horse and buggy to the car to the airplane in that period.
Right, and that's another thing actually that interests me about it, because the world was changing so quickly in every conceivable way, but also our knowledge of the world. This is sort of the Gilded Age of exploration, and so that too is absolutely fascinating. And Churchill was right in the middle of that, and he's right on the cusp of this incredible change, and it's fascinating to see it through his eyes.
A couple of things that are connected. You write, as Churchill escaped the Boer prisoner of war camp and faced dangerous challenges, quote, "It would be a grand adventure, an exploit of the most romantic kind." The notion of British ideas of war as romance is a strong undercurrent in your book. Yet William Manchester, in his introduction to Churchill's memoir, My Early Years, says that his experiences in India and then in South Africa led him to see, quote, "the glorification of war for the fraud it was." Do you agree with that judgment?
Yeah, I do. It's, at that time, the British Empire was huge. It ruled 450 million people, a quarter of the population, and they were spread all over the world. And so they were spread very thin. They were constantly putting down revolts. But to them, these little colonial wars that they would fight, it was all about gallantry, and being dashing, and they hated losing their red coats. They thought the khakis made them look like bus drivers, and they were still, even for the Boer War when it began, they were still fighting in these perfect, precise lines.
So the Boer War really was a prelude to World War I.
It absolutely was. It was the beginning of modern warfare, and I think not that many Americans especially know much about the Boer War, but it was some of the first guerrilla fighting, it was the first concentration camps, the modernization of weapons, and all of those things. So the British Army going in was completely different from the British Army coming out, and it prepared them for World War I.
Right. You write really splendidly about the Boers, people whom most of us know about whom we know very little. Is the Boer presence in South Africa still very strong?
Well, they obviously the prelude to the Afrikaners, and fortunately things are changing a lot. You know, the Boers were interesting people. They were very independent. They were very religious, and they were unabashedly racist. And you know, that's sort of what you may have heard of the Great Trek, where in 1835 they moved from the Cape hundreds of miles into the interior, and that was set off primarily by the fact that 2 years earlier the British Empire had abolished slavery. And so even though the British Empire promised people in Africa, native Africans and the Indian population that was living there, that as soon as they won the war, things would change and be better for them, as we all know, that took much longer than anyone would have hoped. And so, of course, there is still an Afrikaner presence, but you know, obviously Nelson Mandela was a huge breaking point for that, and things have changed quite a bit.
Tell us a little bit about Churchill. He did change the experience in South Africa did change him, but I kept thinking as I was reading your book that a perfectly apt title for it would have been Naked Ambition.
Yeah, absolutely. He was just a bundle of burning ambition. That was the one description of him that's absolutely true throughout his life.
Do you think that is traceable to his feelings about his father?
Some of it, I think it was.
Because, you know, Naked Ambition in well-to-do, of course they weren't rich in the British, but prominent, naked ambition is not really all that common in that particular class.
It's looked down upon.
Yeah.
It's looked down upon, and I've always felt that that was the American in him. His mother, the beautiful socialite Jenny Jerome, was American, and he, and in fact, he told his mother, "This is a pushing age, and we must push with the best."
Right.
And so she was very connected. She had all these powerful men who adored her, and so he was always having her, you know, help me out here, have this person get me an assignment, because he was always throwing himself into wars because he thought that's the best way for me to win fame and propel myself to political power. He called it the glittering gateway to distinction.
Right. You quote at the end the famous remark by his first love, Pamela
Plowden,
who said, when you first meet Winston, you see all the things that are wrong with him, and once you get to know him, you see all the things that are right with him.
That's right.
What was wrong and what was right as you came to know him?
Well, so what was wrong? He was obviously not only ambitious, but incredibly, incredibly arrogant.
Right.
And that is probably true
And self-indulgent.
throughout his life. It was absolutely all about him. In fact, I found it entertaining because again and again and again in letters and journals and different newspaper articles, people would say, you know, that Winston Churchill, I cannot stand the kid. He's going to be prime minister one day, but he drives me crazy.
A very amusing story that she tells us while he was in prison in South Africa. He ordered a tweed suit.
Yeah, exactly. You have to look.
He went to South Africa with what? Cases of champagne and whiskey.
Yeah, and his valet, and 10-year-old whiskey, right? So he's willing to risk his life, but he doesn't want to be uncivilized while he's at it. But what was interesting about him to me at this point in his life is if you look at pictures of him, you almost don't recognize him. So obviously, when we think of Winston Churchill, we think of the older Winston Churchill during war, and he's overweight, and he's older, and he's got his cigar and his whiskey. And this one, he's young, and he has red hair, and he's sort of energetic, and he's the one throwing himself into war. But inside, he was already the Winston Churchill we know, and it's fascinating to read the letters that he wrote at that time. And there was one in particular that he wrote to Pamela Plowden. So he ran for Parliament before the Boer War, and he lost. But during the election, and he's loving it, he's loving all of these opportunities to be on a stage. And he writes to her, he says, I don't know what's going to happen with the election. I don't know what the outcome will be. But with every speech I give, I feel my growing powers.
Something you don't go into in the book because it really occurs after the period that you cover. What happened between him and Pamela?
So this is a great story, actually, because he was in love with her. She was this beautiful young woman. He had met her actually in India when he was there fighting in British India, and she was sort of the toast of London when she went back, and so she had many admirers. But he was in love with her, and he wanted to marry her, but her father wouldn't let her marry him because he didn't think that Churchill would amount to anything.
Finally, Candice, before we turn this over to questions from the floor, could you say a few words about popular history? In his favorable notice of your hero of the empire, the reviewer for the Wall Street Journal last week described you as, quote, a smooth-writing popular historian. I guess that was a compliment. But the phrase popular history has always seemed to me to be slightly pejorative and condescending, even though much of the best history now being written these days is being done by non-academics, Max Hastings, Anthony Beevor, David McCullough, yourself. I'm sure you're pleased to be put in such company, but do you ever feel defensive about being popular?
I don't, to be honest, I feel so incredibly fortunate to be able to do what I do. Every day I go to work, I think, I can't believe that this is my job. My job is to read most of the time and to dig into these fascinating, at least to me, fascinating stories. And, I know a lot of historians. I read a lot of academic histories, and I respect them. Right. It's just not what I do. Right. And I hope that that it's actually a collaborative thing. I hope that there are people who, a lot of people I've met who say, I thought I hated history. I was never interested in history, and then I read something by David McCullough or Anthony Beevor, and I was hooked. And a lot of times they say, and it made me want to know more. And so then I started to read more deeply. So I hope that, in a way, that it's a conduit for people who think that they don't like history to realize that actually they do. And there are these fascinating stories that they will absolutely love.
Well, the so-called popular historians have also stepped into a gap that has been left by the decline of narrative history in the academic departments. Mm-hmm. And there are various theories about the cause of that, but as the academic historians dig more and more deeply into very specialized areas, often with political or ideological patents on them, the field is really left wide open for people who want to tell stories.
Tell stories, right, and that's what I love to do, yeah.
There are microphones in the middle of each aisle, I believe, and you're welcome to come up and ask Candice anything you'd like to. You were first, so you get the first question.
Hi.
Well, being part of the time, at least I teach history and other things in high school, I appreciate your books because they are colorful. History to me is very exciting, and when you take colorful figures or compelling historic figures like you've written about, I think you add quite a bit. Now, when dealing with Churchill and the Boer War, of course, one of the primary sources is going to be a lot of what Churchill wrote. But I always find that he exaggerates things and he likes to put himself in the best light. So how did you deal with the challenge of dealing with that?
Well, the nice thing is that for most of the time, he wasn't alone. So the way he's captured, for those of you who don't know, he went to the Boer War to cover it as a journalist. He was very soon after he arrived, he was on an armored train that was attacked by the Boers. And so his good friend Aylmer Halden had invited him along. He was actually in command of the train, invited him along, and he was there, and many other men, including the Boers who were attacking them. And so I have their accounts of it as well. And the same thing when he was in the POW camp, the other men. So they're almost always, and even when he was on the run, he hid in this coal mine shaft with these white rats for 3 days. The men who helped them also wrote about it. And they really did corroborate. The only thing that I found that he got wrong, and he was very insistent about this, so the man who organized the attack on this train was a man named Louis Botha, and you may know he later became the first prime minister of South Africa, and he was a very young, charismatic, exciting general, and they became friends later in life. And Churchill always insisted that it was Botha personally who had captured him, and then later Churchill's son started researching. He was writing a biography of his father, and he said, I've done the research, and I don't think it could have been Botha. It's impossible that it was Botha who personally captured you. And Churchill said it was. End of discussion. And but it wasn't. But Botha was there. Botha organized it. Botha saw everything and talked about it. But that's the main thing that I think is just not true.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is more of a general historical question in terms of your writing and hearing about how you decide what you're going to use in your research and what you don't use when you do your research. How do historical writers avoid revising history to their own liking?
I'm sorry, they avoid?
How do you avoid revising history to your own personal opinions about things?
Well, I do a lot of research, and I don't come at it sort of with an opinion. I really don't. So, for instance, I wrote a book about James Garfield, and I honestly did come to admire him, but I didn't even set out wanting to write about James Garfield. I was wanting to write about Alexander Graham Bell, and I found out that he invented something called an induction balance to try to find the bullet in Garfield. And I thought, I wonder what James Garfield was like. He was killed so early into his first term, and he's largely been forgotten. And so I start researching him, and he was extraordinary. He was absolutely brilliant. He was kind. He was instrumental in bringing about black suffrage. He was just a decent, modest human being, and I was impressed with him, but I didn't start out thinking I want to make people think that he was this extraordinary man. I took him as I found him, and that's what I try to do with all of my books.
I might interject that I know what he's complaining about, not to pick on one person, but Arthur Schlesinger Jr. In his first in his multi-volume incomplete history of the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Roosevelt, and then in his various writings on Jack Kennedy, was writing from a very distinct ideological point of view, and may have been bending history to suit his ideology.
Sure, I'm sure.
So it does happen.
Absolutely, of course it does. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is actually about Destiny of the Republic. I loved it, and I came away after reading it thinking that we missed out on a potentially great president. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on if Garfield had not been assassinated, what type of president do you think he would have been, and would he have been different than maybe some of those other string of 19th century presidents?
I agree. I believe that he would have been one of our great presidents, and I think that he was an inspiration really to the country because he had come from such poverty, and he seemed to bring the country together in a way that was a sharp contrast from what happened after Lincoln's assassination, where it really divided the country even more. And it's because so many people admired him and so many people had put so much hope into him. And as I said, he was a very progressive thinker for that time. And if you can imagine it, didn't even want to be president, was forced, shoved into this situation. And so I think that because of that, he was uniquely powerful because he wasn't beholden to anyone. He hadn't made any promises, he hadn't made any sacrifices because it's not something he hungered for. And he used to call it the presidential fever, and he saw it all around him because he had been in Congress for almost 18 years. So I do think that would have made him a uniquely powerful president had he lived. And I do think it was quite a loss to the country.
I told Candice when we talked before that I came to the end of Destiny of the Republic with a tremendous sense of loss, that this man never had his opportunity to be the president he could have been.
You made a brief reference to the British policy of concentration camps in the Boer War, which was really one of the most shameful episodes in the British Empire's history, particularly its impact on women and children and other non-combatants. Did Churchill ever acknowledge that, or did that affect him in any way?
Well, what affected him and I don't know if it was his own imprisonment. And it affected him deeply, and he never forgot it. And even though it was completely on the other end of the spectrum from the concentration camps, and just for those of you who don't know, so the British had gotten into the war thinking it's going to last a couple of months, and it started in October, we'll be out by Christmas, and it ended up lasting almost 3 years. And so by the end, they were desperate to get out. And so they did some pretty horrible things. They resorted to scorched earth policy, and they set up these concentration camps for, as you say, the women and children who were supporting these men who were out fighting in the field, the Boers, and so that they wouldn't have any support. And it was disastrous. And Native Africans were also forced into concentration camps, and even more of them died than the Boers. Churchill, on the other hand, his imprisonment, the Boers were eager to show the British that they were civilized too. The British had always sort of dismissed them as sort of being backward and rough, and so they allowed just like incredible leniency. But Churchill couldn't stand the idea of being captured. In fact, he said he hated that period in his life more than he had ever hated any other period in his whole life, and he was desperate to get out. And he remembered that, so later on when he gets into public life and he becomes Home Secretary, it was one of his missions to show compassion to prisoners, and he made sure that they had access to books, they had access to the outdoors, that they could exercise, because he said, whether or not they are guilty of some horrendous crime, they are still human beings.
First off, I'd like to say your first two books were wonderful, some of the best I've ever read.
Thank you very much.
My question is that early on in the book, there's a sort of a passing reference to Teddy Roosevelt. I think the other journalist, Atkins, I believe, had met him in Cuba.
Right.
And I just couldn't believe how close those two seemed. So could you contrast Teddy Roosevelt and Winston Churchill?
Yeah, throughout the process, I kept thinking how much they reminded me of each other, how many similarities they were. These young, incredibly ambitious men, very arrogant, drive everybody around them crazy, incredibly well-read, very, very talented writers. They had so much in common, and I think that's why they really didn't like each other. Too similar, and they did meet, and yeah, it definitely wasn't a love affair. Yeah.
Thank you.
Since Churchill went to South Africa as a journalist, he had certain kind of preconceived notions about the British Empire, and as he experienced the Boer War, how did his view change about the British Empire? Did he really realize, did you see evidence that he realized that the sun was actually setting on the British Empire at this time? And my second question is, if he did that contribute to some of the most amazing things he did in life, like the Battle of London when Hitler was trying to take over England, and he was so stalwart, that idea of I don't ever want to be dominated again. Did you see evidence of him changing his thinking towards what the British Empire was and how he wanted it to fit into the world?
Well, I think we all know that Winston Churchill was far from a perfect man. And one of the things about him is that he was an unabashed imperialist. He was very proud of the British Empire and its standing in the world, and felt that it was part of his mission to keep it intact. And I don't think the Boer War changed that at all. I mean, I think that another thing, and on the opposite side, that I will say about Winston Churchill, and something that I admire, is that although no one fought harder than he did during war, no one was quicker to reach out the hand of friendship afterward, and he was incredibly magnanimous and trying to help someone who had so lately been his enemy. And that was true absolutely during the Boer War, and it got him in trouble with his countrymen, and it was true later in his life. You can see that that was a sort of a constant throughout his life. But he was at that time, and for many, many years, absolutely an imperialist.
Hi. I just want to say that I felt that Destiny of the Republic was an extraordinary book and how much I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
As I was reading it, I totally marveled at the conversations that the characters had with each other. And, you know, as if you had a tape recorder in their room. And I was wondering what you drew upon to get such verisimilitude in terms of what these people were actually saying to each other, or how you did that so well.
That's interesting. My father said the same thing after he read this book. He was like, the dialogue that you have is like, you know, a novel or something. And it's very, very important to me that everybody knows that this is all absolutely factual. And I get that dialogue from letters, from the accounts that they wrote themselves, you know, and so I was talking to Churchill and he said this and I said that, and that's where all of that comes from. And it's very important to me. I think that there's sort of a trend sometimes in narrative nonfiction that in the notes section, you just get a paragraph about each chapter saying kind of in general, these were my sources. But in my books, you can look it up. I use notes, and so you can say, how does she know that he said that? Well, turn to the notes and you can find out, and you can look it up yourself. And so that's something that's really, really important to me. And just going back to primary source material, I mean, it takes me a long time before I will commit to a subject, even if I think it's a fantastic story. And there have been stories that broke my heart because I really, really wanted to tell them, but I finally had to give them up because I just didn't have enough primary source material to work with, to have that dialogue, to have those details that you hope will bring a story alive. And so unless I do, I just won't commit to it. And I had a wealth of information to work with for this book.
Sir?
Thank you.
Hello. You may have touched on this earlier concerning the River of Doubt. As I was reading it, I was just amazed at why Theodore Roosevelt was doing this. Aside, why do you believe, what was his motivation for doing it? I mean, it was just, I don't want to give you my own opinion. But.
Well, so for those of you who don't know the story, so Theodore Roosevelt, he lost the election in 1912, and then he goes to South America, and he goes down this incredibly dangerous, rapids-choked river that no one knows where it leads. That's why the man who found the headwater is called the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt, and because no one knew where it was going to take them and what was around each bend. And the reason he did it was because he was Theodore Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill would have done it too. So he had won and won and won throughout his life, and then he loses this huge contest, and he's a pariah for the first time in his life. He's put Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, in the White House because he split the Republican vote, and he had this depression that had sort of haunted him through his life, and he was devastated. And so he gets this invitation to go on a speaking tour in South America. He's this incredible naturalist, has written many books about especially birds, and so he's going to take another collecting trip. He gets there, and nobody's been preparing. He let this friend of his who was a priest, who hired an Arctic explorer to plan this trip in the Amazon, and so they're not even prepared for just a collecting trip. And he gets there, and the foreign minister says, you could do that, or you could map an unmapped river, and Theodore Roosevelt is going to say no to that? No. And so he throws himself and the people with him into this outrageously dangerous trip.
Just time for one more.
Thank you.
You're the lucky person.
Can you talk a little bit about how you reconstructed the events after President Garfield was shot, particularly the medical care he received? I find it so remarkable that if the doctors had left him alone, he might very well have lived.
Right. Yeah, he would have. So again, for those of you who don't know, so Garfield was shot actually in a train station that was on the mall. It's where the National Gallery now sits. And to my outrage, there is no plaque, no notice at all that an American president was shot here. But the bullet that hit him, that went in the right side of his back, it didn't hit any vital organs, it didn't hit his spinal cord. His injuries were far less severe than Reagan's when Reagan was shot. But he had 12 different doctors, especially this beautifully named Dr. Willard Bliss, whose first name was Doctor, who repeatedly inserted unsterilized fingers and instruments in his back, probing for this bullet, even though Joseph Lister of Listerine had discovered antisepsis 16 years earlier and come here and spoke to American doctors. And so it is sickening to watch this, through the lens of 135 years happening to this extraordinary man. And so I did a ton of research, obviously, at the Library of Congress, because even though Garfield was president for a short time, he had been in Congress for almost 18 years, and his papers and a lot of the people surrounding it were in there. But also I went to the National Museum of Health and Medicine, and they actually have the autopsy report there. But more than that, I held in my gloved hand a section of Garfield's spine with this red plastic pin going through where the bullet had gone through. And it's stunning. And they also have, strangely there, they have what I called the assassin's drawer because they have the remains of Charles Guiteau, who assassinated Garfield, and then they also have the remains of John Wilkes Booth, kind of in the same drawer. There's the femur, there's the ankle bone. It's just bizarre. They also have a jar with chunks of Guiteau's brain, and he was insane. He was mentally ill, and after he was executed, they exhumed his body, and they wanted to study it for science to see, especially his brain, to see if you could see physical signs of insanity. And so they cut up his brain and they sent it to experts around the country, and they sent it back and said, well, he probably had syphilis, but that's all we can tell. And they put it in this jar and they still have it. Thank you.
Candice told me before we started this program that she is still looking around for her next subject. She also admitted that a book for her is about a 5-year project. Candice, I'm almost 77 years old, and I want to read your next book, so you better get going. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jonathan.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.